So hello again. Here we are for the second part of today's program. Seeing that I'm pushing you very much for the time, the technicians were good with you, so they gave us an extra 5 minutes. They actually, and that's important for the speakers, they installed the microphones in a different way so that we speak close to the microphones. It's necessary for the interpreters to be able to follow what we're doing. So we go now to session number 7, which is marine protection and restoration. For this one, we have, again, a very good and excellent array of panelists, and I will start by inviting up here with me Antonia Leroy from WWF European Policy Office. Antonia, welcome. Please give a hand. Second chair, please. And our rapporteur for the session will be Eric Ros Salazar from Migramar from Costa Rica. Please join me. Thank you very much. And the speakers in this session are Ole Westergaard from the UN Environment Programme. Ole, thank you very much for being with us. We have, by remote connection, Joseph Appiot from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing Joseph. We have Cristina Simioli from Renewables Grid Initiative. Cristina, please join us. We have Marta Martinez Gil Pardo de Vera from the Ministry of the Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge in Spain. Jose Julio Casas from the Ministry of Environment in Panama. And last but not least, Paul Elsner from the University of London, England, UK. This session is about, as I said, marine protection and restoration, and we already heard a few things about ecosystem-based MSP and so on. In this session, what we will do is to explore approaches and mechanisms that can make MSP contribute to environmental protection and restoration. And with this, I'm leaving this to the able hands of Antonia Leroy. So, Antonia, please take over the moderation of this session.
Thank you, Spiros, and good morning, everyone. So I'm here to help co-moderating this session, but first to give you a bit of a summary of Monday discussion, the roundtable that we had. So I will start by the main challenges experts have raised and the recommendations that were provided to open the discussion of today's session. So the main challenges, when I saw all the notes, could be summarized as how we. Not why. I don't think we don't need to be convinced here today on why it's important to protect nature and restore nature, but on how we. So, you know, like in Google, when you do a search and like how we ... and there's many options, I actually did the test this morning. And so just to understand if also people were asking a question about protection of nature. And there was one on the top 3. How we can save water, actually. One was about how we celebrate Diwali, and the other one, how we got pregnant. So just coming back to our baby today, about marine protection and restoration, this is what was raised. So how we push political pressure to capture MPA in MSP, especially when it's not a priority or is not a must-have. How we ensure connectivity, identifying the right site, the scale, and the conservation outcomes. How we create this connectivity in the ecosystem when we lack science, for instance, or knowledge. Recently, there was a case that was discussed in Mozambique when they discovered a really important area for mantas and whale sharks. And they also have found that it's the same species in Maldives. So how we connect, you know, this ecosystem. There was also a case in Japan where they say, okay, we have MPSs 100 years protecting a specific species. So how we ensure connectivity through time as well and through the years of, to come in the area of climate change. And we know that building network after designation is more difficult, so this needs to be thought from the start. So how do we protect such a wide space across border? Meaning how we standardize, you know, the way we define species and the way we speak together as well. How do we scale up MP at global level to ensure this connectivity, meaning beyond national jurisdictions? How we deal with cumulative impact when we have knowledge gap? How we define strictly our highly protected area? What is the definition of that, and what is effective conservation measure? How we ensure restoration in this protected area as well? How we create coherent approach when we have different legal entities in one country or region, local authorities, how we are taking forward this MSP process to protect nature. And lastly, how human can rely on nature. It's a question that is important to protect nature. So now the recommendation. There was few that was kind of targeted to government or authorities or MSP planner, is to ensure connectivity in MSP to optimize conservation goals. So as we said, there is challenge because if we protect a species in one country but not in the neighboring countries, the conservation of course might be really weak in a way. So this is really about transboundary cooperation to scale up marine protection beyond national jurisdiction as well. We need to designate buffer zone around MPA so they not become also paper park, because there were cases where oil platform were just placed outside MPA, and so the conservation outcome was also weakened. We need to facilitate guidelines to understand OECM and to evaluate the conservation outcome. We need to ensure coordination with other policy processes. And we need to ensure education program and awareness for marine protection. And I think in the previous session, the co-moderator Katerina also mentioned that I think it's cross-continental sessions. And last but not least, we need to add the human dimension to have buy-in from people as well and stakeholders, and create opportunity to locally manage this protected area within the MSP process. There was one recommendation for scientists. Please consider the timeline of MSP processes an opportunity for intervention when you start to do your research. And two recommendations for all to conclude. We need a common approach on terminology, policy and management, to have discussion and to limit the jargon that each kind of scientist, policymaker have. To really move forward. And we need to create mechanisms, maybe processes to monitor MPA within the MSP for the purpose of measuring increasing biodiversity. So what we call sometimes nature positive. It could only improve for now. We cannot go back. So with that in mind, I will now give the floor to our great panelists to show us what are their solutions, as some are already ongoing. And I will first give the floor to Ole Vestengren from the UN Environmental Programme. The floor is yours.
Good morning, all. I'd like to thank the organizers, DG Mara and UNESCO, for organizing this meeting and inviting our presentation here. And I would like to talk briefly about how we're building synergies between the ocean decade and the restoration decade running in parallel, and how we support holistic ocean management through nature-based solutions. And I think everybody in this conference room knows all about the ocean decade, but perhaps fewer knows about the restoration decade. In short, restoration decade support local and ocean global action to restore ecosystems and halt their future degradation. And they cover land, mountains, forests, rivers and lakes, and marine and coastal ecosystems. And the key focus of the restoration decade is nature-based solutions. For example, supporting blue carbon approaches, MPAs to build coastal resilience. Importantly, restoration is about taking a holistic approach. It's not about single actions to plant trees or build a single coral reef. Restoration and conservation and management must go hand in hand. In fact, the reality is restoration is very expensive. It's 5 more times expensive to restore an ecosystem than to invest in good management to keep it healthy in the first place. It's also about creating the right enabling conditions for meaningful restoration. And put very simply, it's not about planting trees, it's about growing the trees. And that this means understanding multiple drivers, direct and indirect, and mitigate different impacts that can degrade ecosystems, and understanding both environmental, social, and economic drivers. So, to be fully effective, restoration must be embedded in a wider ecosystem-based management approach. And this requires cross-sector policy and joined-up institutions and actions. But as we know, this is also very complicated, and there are many challenges and questions. So UNEP and IOC are working to connect the two decades, and we are preparing a program to address gaps in knowledge, practical actions, and management tools. There are multiple questions. We already dealt with some of them today and yesterday. How do we practically deal with trade-offs? How do we organize governance to deal with climate change? How can economic models drive a whole society approach? And how can we design sustainable blue economy that enable nature-based climate solutions? And I'm sure you have many more questions, and I invite you to join us in these discussions and this new effort between the decades. Here the assumption is that the sustainable blue economy, that we discussed it here in this week, can enable nature-based solutions in different ways. But what does a sustainable blue economy look like? And how do we support a transition to sustainable, resilient, and equitable blue economy? Clearly, marine spatial planning, coastal zone management, source-to-sea approaches are all important elements of a blue economy transition. But we need to anchor the transition in a clear vision for sustainability and guided by a strong integrated policy framework. And we need to build the enabling conditions to drive a transition to a sustainable economy. And so to help countries and stakeholders deal with this complexity in a practical manner, UNEP has developed what we call a Sustainable Economy Transition Framework. It's a policy and governance support tool that helps planners organize and steer the blue economy transition, considering environmental, social, and economic objectives together. It helps make an often conceptual discussion practical and real. In very short, just to note that it considers 5 core elements, which is a bit hard to see, but the 5 core elements are restoring, conserving, and regenerating ecosystems, building equity and benefit sharing, addressing climate resilience, promoting sustainable consumption and production, and applying circular economy approaches. And the framework organizes this process in 3 phases. It's about really understanding the system and the system linkages. It's about enhancing the system by setting a strategic vision for a blue economy and building a strong integrated policy framework for sustainable economy. And then delivering change, implementing the integrated policy framework using tools like marine spatial planning, coastal management, etc. And through the process, a number of enabling actions support the planning and the policy discussions and the implementation, including governance, sound science, finance, stakeholder engagement, and so forth. And I'm happy to provide further details on this new tool. We are currently pilot testing in a few countries, Vietnam, Antigua Barbuda, Trinidad, Tobago, and we're planning to publish it mid-spring, summer next year. And we think it can be a helpful contribution to address some of the challenges at MSP and blue economy. So to sum up some key messages, there's a need for a whole-of-government approach to really address the triple crisis of climate, nature loss, and pollution. The ocean science policy nexus is important to anticipate the change, managing for a future that will be. We are not restoring for what was, we need to restore and consider what will be. Marine spatial planning and taking a 100% ocean management approach is a key to deliver sustainable economy. And finally, there's a real need for more practical and also equitable nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ole, for taking us through the transition to sustainable blue economy with concrete steps. So I will now give the floor to a person who will join remotely, Joseph Appiot, who works for the Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So I'm waiting for the technician maybe to... Good morning, Joseph.
Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for indulging my remote participation here. Greetings from Montreal. It's about 5:20 in the morning, so it's a little bit early for me, but We're working hard here in Montreal in preparations for the forthcoming COP15. I understand that the organizers should have my slides. Perhaps they can put those up now, unless they're already being displayed. Fantastic. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the this issue of MSP in the context of a forthcoming what we hope will be adopted at CBD COP15, a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework. This will contain a new set of global goals and targets for the planet, including for the ocean, and will provide an important opportunity for marine spatial planning. And before I jump into this, also let me again thank the European Commission and IOC UNESCO for obviously for this conference and for inviting our participation here. So when we're talking about the post-2020 framework, our starting point is where we left off from the Aichi biodiversity targets. I think these are probably familiar to most, if not all of you. These are a set of time-bound targets that were adopted by the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity back in 2010 and had a 2020 deadline. Of course, COP15 was supposed to be held in 2020, but a number of major world events changed things, as we all know. Now, looking back at what happened with the Aichi targets, we saw that there was an enormous progress in different areas, and indeed they did catalyze political will and support and capacity building to advance conservation and sustainable use on various fronts. But unfortunately, we saw that there was not one of the Aichi biodiversity targets were fully achieved with respect to all of their elements. This includes for Aichi target 11, which is the protected areas target, in which we saw a robust progress on the quantitative element and pushing towards the quantitative element, but inadequate and comparable progress with respect to the qualitative elements, things like the effectiveness of protection and the equitability of the governance and the connectivity, among others. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now we are embarking, hopefully soon, on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This will be a new framework that will be adopted or submitted for adoption by the 15th Conference of the Parties to the CBD, which will take place in just a few weeks here in Montreal. This will contain a new set of global goals with a 2050 deadline and targets with a 2030 milestones, and is intended to be a global framework, not only for CBD parties. It importantly aims to address biodiversity and the range of services that it provides for people, for livelihoods, nutrition, climate change, basically all of the different facets of biodiversity and how it underpins not only a healthy planet, but also sustainable development. And as you can see there from the theory of change, it takes a logical approach in terms of looking at the the types of actions that are needed through the 2030 action targets, basically what actions we need to do, what responses we need to implement. And then with those being obviously a logical stepping stone to the 2050 outcomes, the 2050 goals, where we actually want to see the state of biodiversity and ecosystems by 2050, and those elements being a reflection of the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, which was adopted way back in 2010. Next slide, please. Now, there has been some criticism, and I think in some perhaps a bit of confusion regarding the place of oceans in the post-2020 framework. There was throughout the process some discussion and some calls for a specific ocean goal or ocean target, but in the process to develop the framework, the parties decided that rather than having, let's say, biome-specific targets and goals, that all of the goals and targets would be crafted to be generic and applicable to all biomes. There's a number of reasons for this, but one of which being the need to basically address all the different drivers of biodiversity loss in all different biomes, and avoiding the situation where only a certain types of actions and approaches are seen as relevant for a specific biome versus others. So in this regard, ocean issues are really spread throughout the framework, and nearly all aspects of the framework are seen to be relevant and applicable in the oceans. And as I said, the intention here is to focus on better addressing the drivers of biodiversity loss. And in reflections with respect to the Aichi efforts to achieve the Aichi targets, saw that the inadequate addressing of drivers of biodiversity loss was one of the main reasons for the failure to achieve the Aichi targets and the goals and the outcomes that we wanted to see from those. So this also speaks to the need for broader engagement of the ocean community. Obviously, with respect to the CBD and goals and targets, the conservation community and the conservation world is very much on board and obviously very active in driving that agenda. But we've seen less attention and engagement, and importantly, less implementation and response from various sectors and users of the ocean. In addition, in terms of the ocean aspects of the framework, the work on indicators is expected to continue. Of course, there needs to be a mandate from the COP to do that, but we expect that this work to elaborate indicators for the goals and targets will continue, and also obviously therein be a key opportunity to understand how oceans are reflected in the framework. In addition, we're hoping to have a mandate from the COP to revise and update the CBD marine program of work, which in our view will be a key opportunity to elaborate the specific issues and concerns of the marine environment with respect to the post-2020 framework. Next slide, please. So obviously, the entire framework and all of its goals and targets are still under negotiation. And I apologize, it seems that my slides, the content of my slides may have been cut off by the template we're using, but I think you get the idea. As you can see here, there's a subset of some of the goals and targets that I've picked out and that are highly relevant to marine spatial planning. I think we can look at the targets first. And indeed, actually, target 1 is a spatial planning target and was initially set up to be a spatial planning target, but also—
Joe, excuse me, if you can hear me. Sorry, as a matter of time, could I ask you to conclude in 1 minute?
Absolutely,
please?
absolutely.
Thank you.
So there you can just see just a few of the targets and goals that are relevant to marine spatial planning. And I'll just move on there, but just to say that there are quite a number of targets and goals. Next slide, please. So basically, a post-2020 framework is a major opportunity to bend the curve, put us on a track towards the sustainability. But the key message here is that we need a whole of society approach and a package of actions, and marine spatial planning, given its focus on balancing different priorities and uses, is a really obviously logical and useful framework to do this. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for this very forward-looking presentation. Yeah, we made the Aichi target, but we know that implementation is lacking and sometimes it's paperback. So I'm really glad you mentioned this implementation part and maybe, building indicator on what is biomass, etc. So thank you for your presentation. So I will now call our next speaker, Cristina Simioli from the Renewable Grid Energy. Cristina.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So through my presentation, I will respond not to the how, but with whom, actually. With whom do we have to find possible solutions to the questions that we have just heard of. And I'm going to talk to you about the collaborations of energy industry with the NGOs. So let me start from when we talk about energy, and specifically I'm talking about offshore wind, many forget a very crucial component of having renewables in place, which actually is the grid. So let me start from the grid. So I am part of an association called Renewables Grid Initiative. This is a kind of unique collaboration between transmission system operators and NGOs in Europe. More than 12 years ago, the intuition was to bring those two group of stakeholders, which we might maybe say that traditional, they perceive each other as maybe enemies, one developing an infrastructure and the others opposing to the development of the infrastructure. We brought brought them together under a common objective, the one of allowing increasing shares of renewables and the recognition of the need of the grid infrastructure in order to integrate those renewables, so that collaborations are possible under common objectives. And this collaboration brought us in more than 12 years in working on principles for better environmental performance of the infrastructure, but also for better stakeholder engagement. We started working in 2015 on the impact of subsea cables, environmental impacts of subsea cables. And this work led us in 2018 then to release a marine grid declaration. We identified principles for the marine grid to be developed, and again covering and having transmission system operators, NGOs committing to contribute to this, each on their respective roles, of course. The Marine Grid Declaration brought attention to us from the wind industry, because it was clear that we would have increasing targets of offshore renewables, and it is clear that offshore wind without the grid cannot actually happen. This is how we reach in 2020 the point of deciding to collaborate. We brought together through a collaborative project the wind industry representatives, being Wind Energy Association, wind developers, of course, but also representatives of the supply chain of the wind industry, along with transmission system operators and NGOs, and I would say climate and environmental NGOs, because there is also here a difference, to work together. So on which base? We decided to work together actually to cover two aspects. One, we all recognize the need to speed up the renewables deployment. And this is because we all recognize that we are on a path toward decarbonization, and we do need to collaborate in order to make this happen. But at the same time, we decided to collaborate because we need that this deployment happens in alignment with conservation and restoration objectives. And so that here comes, of course, the environmental part of it and the impacts. Today, we have 27 members that on a yearly basis decide on what to work on together. And at the center, there is biodiversity. Now, from the very beginning, in our work plan, we always identified as a key topic the maritime spatial planning. Why? For obvious reasons. Offshore wind and grid are among the users of the sea, but also because there has been an agreement among all members that in order to discuss about sustainability of offshore wind and the grid, we also have to look at the broader marine management, meaning that we have to look at the broader picture. We have to look at the other users of the sea. We have to look at an allocation that actually balances different interests. And so that this goes beyond, which is very relevant, but goes beyond the individual infrastructure. This is why, from the very beginning, this meant that we needed to get acquainted with the process. So we have here a beautiful community of planners, but you can imagine that this has not been actually a topic easy to digest for all of us, so that we had actually associations like WWF, like BirdLife, but also Wind Europe, that are actually doing the assessment of the MSP plans in Europe to contribute to this discussion. And this is very important because this means bringing the relevance of the MSP process into a discussion with one of the sectors that is a key sector. And this means that for us it became an opportunity to actually come up with an analysis based on the analysis of these three different stakeholders, so WWF, BirdLife, and Wind Europe, to actually come together and to understand how the MSP process can be improved in order actually to enable it to become, as it is already today, but to become even more a key tool to identify suitable areas for renewables. Now, as you can see here, we identified, of course, improvements, and we engage on these topics, and this is very much in line with the work and the pillars of the roadmap, so that, of course, we are aligned and we are ready to contribute. An ecosystem-based approach in MSP is key, and so that we are looking, of course, at effects, cumulative effects of offshore wind and other activities. Sensitivity mappings are key. These are applied sometimes at project level, but this needs actually to be applied at planning level. Enabling cross-border collaborations, we heard about why this is relevant, and we are part of this conversation. Very important, we continue to support all of us, wind industry and NGOs, the importance of applying and implement the EU nature law to the high standard, because this is important, and this is what actually the entire coalition does, is that acceleration does not mean sacrificing then the environment. At the same time, we, of course, are part of stakeholder engagement processes, and we actually involve the industry even more and put them in touch with all other actors. And we do need to adopt a long-term perspective. And with this, I close, and this is for one reason. Today, looking at Wind Europe assessment of the maritime spatial plans in Europe, they say that 52,000 square kilometers of the sea areas, an equivalent of 220 gigawatt, have been allocated to offshore development in the MSPs analyzed. Now, this is in consideration of the fact that member states have not yet allocated the 30% of marine protected areas, so that we know that in the long term, also going beyond 2030, these two will for sure have overlaps, and we do need to find solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. And being part of this coalition from the start, I can say it was a challenge also to speak the same language, but now we do have some interest in common, as Christina mentioned, in terms of having a good MSP process, ecosystem-based MSP process. So I will now call our next speaker, Marta Martina Gil Pardo de Vera, from the Ministry from the Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge in Spain. Marta, the floor is yours.
Buenos días a todos. Es un placer estar aquí hoy con vosotros.
It is a great pleasure
Voy a hacer
being
esta
with
primera
all of
intervención
you
en
here.
español
I will begin
para
speaking in
hablaros de los
Spanish
vínculos que
to
existen
explain the different links between the MSP and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive.
Comenzando cronológicamente,
In chronological order, we have to go back to 2008 when this Framework Director on Marine Strategies was published, a directive that applies to countries into the European Union and that invited their countries to work based in four main goals: protecting and restoring marine ecosystems, preventing and, of course, reducing waste disposal into the oceans, and recovering and restoring the marine ecosystems that had been negatively impacted by human activities, in fulfilling with the good environmental status. A good environmental status is defined by 11 factors that are on your right side on the screen, and that focus on the status of the marine elements, that is biodiversity, integrity of the seabed, and the different food chains. And other of these elements are more related to how to mitigate pollution, for example, waste disposal, underwater noise, alien species that were mentioned earlier. So the directive invited the countries to work on marine strategies, to work on adaptive processes in 6-year cycles. In these cycles, we need to reassess the environmental status of our marine environment based on some indicators that allow the countries to monitor if they are complying with the different elements defined in the good environmental status. In 2014, the MSP directive was published. In this case, the goals were related to the sustainable growth of blue economies and using sustainably the marine resources. So now it is a matter of redistributing the spaces that are being used for different activities, and we need to reassess how these different activities coexist and how they interact, and we need also to account for land-sea interactions. And we consider in this directive energy uses, shipping, recreation, offshore aquaculture, fisheries, and of course biodiversity conservation. So we need to account for social and economical factors as well as environmental factors to contribute to a sustainable preservation of our marine economies, but also using an ecosystem approach, because that is the key of the link between these two directives. We need to be aware that human activities have a great pressure on our marine environment, so when we try to plan the use of our marine environment, we need to account for the pressure that human activities apply to the marine environment. And if we look at it from the sustainability point of view, we are going to see the benefits of working towards sustainability, because we will contribute to the mitigation of climate change, we will take care of the livelihood of many of our citizens, etc. So it is a matter of a sustainable management of human activities, but always keeping in mind that the end goal is to achieve a good environmental status for our marine environments. How have we been working on this in Spain? In 2010, we worked on the law that transposed this framework directive, and in 2016, we transposed this framework directive through a royal decree that works on the marine environmental protection. In this law, this act, we mentioned some principles that are key to manage those tools. First, adaptive management, so we can incorporate the new knowledge that arises, and also adaptation in cycles. And we have applied the 6-year cycles for both tools. We also talk about these protection principle. We also need to use the marine resources in a sustainable manner so the future generation can still have access to such resources. And of course, we analyze the compatibility of human activities with our environmental goals. Thanks to this, we have a great tool for managing our marine strategy. And through this tool, we work on MSP.
Estas dos herramientas van a tener
un
mismo ámbito de aplicación.
Hand in hand have the same application areas, which are the 5 marine areas in Spain.
Estos planes son parte
so we have 5 plans, 5 MSP plans to cover our 5 marine areas. What does this mean in practice? This means that marine strategies are giving us solid information to be aware of the social and economical case of our areas, and MSP helps us assure, guarantee that the activities that take place in our marine areas are sustainably focused. Thank you.
So thank you, Marta. And there was, a question on how we create coherency between policies. So I think you answered it quite well with the case of Spain, linking the maritime strategy framework directive and MSP. So having this kind of holistic approach, especially in the context which can be challenging for Spain to have 5 MSP. So thank you for that. So I will now call our next speaker, José Julio Casas from the Ministry of Environment in Panama. The floor is yours.
Hola, buenos días.
Good morning. I'm going to speak in Spanish. I am very grateful for having been invited here. We will try to showcase a regional initiative that we've been working on. There are 4 countries in this initiative, which is called Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor, in Spanish CMAR. These are the acronym. And we are being used as an example to follow in other regions in the world. A few elements, a few brief history. Since 2002, Costa Rica and Ecuador were already talking about establishing some regional link to improve preservation of some areas that were migratory flow areas in which we had very relevant species. And in 2002 as well, we discussed the possibility of adding Colombia and Panama within this initiative, a science-based initiative, by the way. And then in 2004, in San Jose, we signed the San Jose Declaration that established the Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor. This is a completely voluntary and non-binding initiative, and it is worth mentioning the non-binding element. And then we jumped to 2 years ago when we worked on the first action plan where we work on all the guidelines that we wanted to follow on this marine corridor. And then last year in the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, we signed the Glasgow Declaration that aims to bring this initiative to a higher level, this initiative among these 4 countries that I mentioned. The decisions that are made within the marine corridor follow the structure that you see on screen and are based on consensus. It is not a matter of voting, but rather reaching an agreement among the 4 countries so we can guarantee that the decision is truly regional, because we all need to agree. And very quickly, this is the structure of the marine corridor. At the highest level, we have the regional ministerial committee that take a pro-tempore presidency, and we go north to south. Currently, at the moment, Panama has the presidency pro tempore, and that is why I'm the technical secretary pro tempore for this secretariat that works directly at the ministerial level. And the secretariat also is supported by the regional working groups that deals with different issues. The goal of this marine corridor is to guarantee protection and preservation, but we always account for a sustainable use of the resources as well. And that is why we work with 4 working groups, MPA's group, the group devoted to science, the other one is devoted to fisheries, communications, etc. We also have a regional technical committee that reviews all the technical analyses that we receive and looks for new funding possibilities, looks at different initiatives that come from governments and countries in Asia, for example, as well. So this technical committee that has 2 representatives from each country is the committee that is devoted to reviewing all these elements. And they are the engine of the marine corridor, so to speak, because once they have reviewed all the content, they go to the regional ministerial committee so the ministers can make the decisions. Our structure is very interesting because the Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor has 5 core parts that are islands. We have the Cocos Island, the Galapagos in Ecuador, and Coiba and Gorgona. Those are the core parts, but the marine corridor includes the entire area that connects Costa Rica to the Galapagos Island. It's not a transnational MPA, but it is a corridor that is highly recognized, is well renowned because of the migratory processes that take place in it.
Entonces, para ir cerrando, es sumamente importante tener presente que al basarse en áreas protegidas, esta conectividad necesita que esas áreas protegidas
this linking between the MPAs need that require communication between the countries that govern all these different MPAs. That is why we have begun an extension process to connect these MPAs so we can work towards the 30% that has been mentioned in this conference several times.
Los límites se hayan conectado,
and we have interconnected the different borders. And once we have done that, once we have connected the different borders based on biological connection, interconnection, all the work that takes place between these areas is complementary.
No es funcional establecer áreas protegidas si el valor protector no es real, o sea, si no es funcional el área protegida y luego
but we do not protect those MPAs, then our work doesn't make any sense, and that is why we need to work in a connected manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, and really pleased to see that Panama is working on marine corridor and have well-connected MPA as it has a start. And thank you for sharing also the institutional structure. Always interesting to see how countries have different setup. So I will call our last speaker. So Paul Hansen from the University of London. Paul.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this event. It's fascinating to be here. I want to speak about offshore wind, in particular in the context of its implication to marine spatial planning. We have a lot spoken about marine spatial planning in the context of particular areas, mainly exclusive economic zones. And today I would like to turn it slightly on its head and just look at one sea use, offshore wind, and how it actually affects and shapes marine spatial planning and how it disseminates to the planning procedures. And I think we have all experience, or many stakeholders here in the room can confirm that offshore wind in many parts of the world, clearly in Europe, is driving marine spatial planning. We have a marine spatial planning directive in Europe, and this is closely related to the advent of offshore wind at the same time in the last 10 to 15 years. Now, if you look at offshore wind, it's an extremely important use of the coastal zone or of the marine zone, as we all know, but it's also a very important element and tool and aspect for us to address climate change. And so we all know this. We have had a special session already on climate ready and climate appropriate MSP. And just to give you a scale of what we need to do in addition to what we do already. So in the year 2025, in the year 2020, we had installed on a global scale about 35 gigawatts of offshore wind. Just to give you as an order of magnitude, 1 gigawatt is about one big nuclear power plant. So 35 equivalent of 35 nuclear power plants have been installed by 2020. But in order for us to decarbonize our energy system, we need to really accelerate dramatically. And the targets have been mentioned already in the previous talks. And on a global scale, I think we have to ramp it up. And these are figures from the Global Wind Energy Council, who just looked at the Paris Agreement targets and see actually what do we need to do in order to reach our Paris Agreement targets. So we have to grow our offshore wind by to 270 gigawatt by the end of this decade. It's less than 10 years, 7 to 8 years. And then from there on, we have to accelerate even stronger and going up to 2,000 gigawatts. So in dramatic, it's really a revolution happening on the seas. And so this will clearly impact marine spatial planning and the work of most people here in the room. This will be one of the core criteria. So looking at the distribution, right now offshore wind is happening within the EEZs, whereas governments, coastal states regulating the process and managing it, trying to manage it as best as possible within the EEZs. Now, you have seen the dramatic numbers I just gave you, and these are just not projections. This is actually what we need to do, and it's already morally, at least for the targets to 2030, there have been already firm government commitments around the world being made who are reaching this kind of scale. So at some point, offshore wind will run out of space because it's a very space-hungry use, and it's also a semi-permanent use. A fishing boat goes fishing, it disappears. Offshore wind is there to stay. We had a talk already about grid connections and grid infrastructure. So the question is, could we go beyond the EEZs to something called the areas beyond national jurisdictions, or sometimes referred to as the high seas, ABNJs? And just to report you, we did a study, just looked at this aspect and used two basic scenarios, bottom fixed offshore wind and floating offshore wind. And if we look at floating offshore wind, we can see there are actually quite some prospective areas in Canada, in the Grand Banks, Flemish Cup of Newfoundland. We have of the EEZs of the UK and Faroe Islands, Ireland. We have two relatively shallow areas, Hatton Ridge and Rockall Bank. We have the Mascarene Plateau, which is bounding on the EEZs of Mauritius and the Seychelles. And then also of New Zealand, we have the Challenger Plateau. And these are really big areas where we have several hundred of gigawatt capacity. When it comes to implementing offshore wind on high seas, the legal situation is very different. In the EEZs, we need to have a license, and it's a very strongly and tightly regulated activity. On the high seas, there's hardly anything needed. All you need, within the context of the law of the sea, UNCLOS, an offshore wind installation, regardless if it's bottom fixed or floating, there's a reference in this very loose reference of within the context of artificial islands and artificial structures put on the sea. And they have a similar status than ships, because the only thing that's being needed is the flag state. It needs to be registered to a particular state. It can be anywhere in the world. And so we have the situation that we have moving into a situation where we might, maybe not now, but maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, where we have a situation, for example, within the UK, that we have a highly regulated, and also in terms of environmental protection, highly regulated procedures establishing offshore wind. And then a few miles further out, we would have kind of a very loosely defined aspects. Fortunately, there's interesting developments going on. The previous speaker mentioned already something called the BBNJ process. It's an ongoing negotiation towards protecting biodiversity on the areas beyond national jurisdictions. And there's, within the BBNJ agreements, we have something called area-based management. Essentially, it's just a different word for marine spatial planning. So it would be really interesting to at least consider at some point how to link these kind of processes happening in terms of marine spatial planning within the EEZs, but also going further beyond. Because right now we don't have any, there's no authority, there's nothing that makes the EEZ work. So there's no administration, there's no data portal, and so on. With this, I'll say thank you. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I think it was really interesting to see number, but also to see, the legality of putting offshore wind farm in the IC and to have few already in sight. So I will now have a few questions for you before giving back the floor to the moderator for the Slido sessions. So my first question, because we saw in the presentation some challenges, but also some solutions. But what do you see as the main challenge for your country to implement MSP while really considering nature protection? For instance, Marta, not to put you on the spot, but yeah.
Let's see if it works, yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you to let me break the ice, this discussion. Yeah, challenges. For me, well, the first challenge is to effectively include this ecosystem approach in general terms, and this could be done in different ways. The first one would have just explained in the case of Spain to establish this legal framework. Well, you have to set the basis for the process and of course link both issues. Obviously, when we start planning, we need to define some principles, some objectives that we need to comply with. So establishing as an objective of general interest the protection of the marine environment, I would say that it is it's challenging, but it is also like one of the first things that we have to do. There's another challenge that is about dealing with data. We have to gather a lot of information. I also mentioned that marine strategies are providing with a lot of information for the plans, but we can also use information from other tools, such as the river basin management plans or others that may exist. This could be challenging. In the case of Spain, maybe more, because we have a complex administrative structure that could also pose, some difficulties in this sense. And I also would like to mention the importance of considering this concept of one data, many uses or many purposes. So we're talking about optimization of monitoring. So if we are monitoring one data in the marine strategies dealing, for example, with habitats, we need to use that for other purposes, also for the marine spatial plans. So optimization, one data, several purposes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta. And thank you for sharing these challenges, but also where to start. I'm wondering maybe, within this transition to sustainable blue economy, Ole, what do you see as a challenge for country maybe to really ensure there is nature protection?
Thank you. I think in general, it depends on the purpose of the MSP process. I think there's this notion that is either blue growth or nature. And increasingly, I think there's a realization that it's not either or, but then how do you find that balance? Clearly, many blue sectors are relying on healthy ecosystem biodiversity, so they have a clear self-interest to build it into the planning. So the question there is, it is a lot complex, and then how do you build the right policy coherence across sectors, and not only on the paper and in the sort of boardrooms, but down into the process. And if there's no clear objectives and it's not traded off and decided, but this conflict are fed into the zoning process, then of course it's difficult. Then the process becoming even more complicated and perhaps not even successful. So this, as I mentioned before, this steer from policy and governance early on in the process into the and there are tools available. I know there's a classic strategic environmental assessment tools. There are other. We know actually how to do it. It's about actioning this and bringing it into reality. Thanks.
Okay. No, thank you very much. And I think it's a perfect link for a follow-up question to Christina and Paul, maybe, because you have touched on offshore renewable energy within the context of MSP, while also reflecting the need for nature. But from your point of view, maybe what do you see as a main challenge, maybe one example, and what could be a main challenge and a key value added for country, to move both towards the direction of climate and biodiversity goal, not separate them?
Okay. Yes, it works. Okay, thank you. There is a challenge that in order to actually being able to address at the same time the climate and the biodiversity crisis, we really do need to, on one side, keep improving the performance and the environmental performance of the infrastructure, so that there are measures that can be applied and that can have an impact. And this is something that we are looking into, for instance, in nature inclusive design, how this can be done, how can we involve stakeholders in order actually to improve the design of the infrastructure. But as I was saying before, we also, and it was mentioned actually, the restoration, we do believe that also restoration is an important part, so that we do need need, business to move away, and we see already commitments in this, the approach of avoiding and reducing the impacts, but actually we do need, to have restoration as our horizon, because this is what is needed in order not just to halt, but also to reverse the biodiversity loss. In terms of solutions, I do have to, the challenge, I do have to agree, of course, on the data part, so that, data is a key challenge, but it has been mentioned in many different ways. We actually produced biodiversity monitoring data for offshore wind, which is an overview. It's a discussion paper with an overview, actually, of all protocols that are available with regards to offshore wind, because we are looking into this and we do need to find a solution. And at the same time, last challenge is that if we want, as also we have business representatives who are committing to a net positive effect on biodiversity on their operations, we do need methodologies, we do need indicators, and we do need, actually to be able to measure this. And this needs to be harmonized, because there are different attempts, but we do need to do this in a harmonized way in order actually to use this common knowledge.
Yes, well, that's a very comprehensive answer, and I doesn't leave much to say. It's a really nice answer, and so it's very convenient for me just to invent some gaps. And I just want to make a general point that it is important for us, or that offshore wind very often enables us to collect data, actually, and to release new funds. And very often oceanographers and marine biologists and the rest of the science community, they have always struggled for funding, and now suddenly there's a very interesting and good angle and to justify funding, developing baseline studies and just to generate new knowledge. Yesterday I spoke to a colleague from South Africa, and she said, yeah, she's now being tasked to do baseline studies on marine mammals. So this is something also positive.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And not forgetting about you, Joe, online, because you heard the speaker about the challenge on data collection, and within the process of the CBD, to have post-2020 biodiversity objective. What do you think about that, while you're creating indicators?
Well, yeah, thank you for the question. I think, as was mentioned a few times, the importance of having, I think, harmonization and consistency across different types of data collection efforts, and using data for multiple purposes. One thing we're seeing in looking for the indicators at the initial level is that often they exist in different forms. The data exists in different forms, is collected in different forms around the world for different purposes. And the purposes for which we might need it will differ from the form in which it exists. So I think as we look into the future and we look into data collection into the future, considering the multiple purposes for which it can be used at the outset, so that it's set up in a way that can be applicable to different circumstances. I think in that regard, and also thinking about the challenges of MSP more broadly, and how to engage and include nature and restoration and things like that in MSP is ensuring that the users and the data collectors and those that are actually doing things in the marine space are fully engaged, and that conversely we're also making sure that conservation and nature are really embedded in the mandates and priorities and work that they do. And importantly, in the context of the tools and the language that they use, so making it clear that that considering biodiversity and nature is not simply just an additional task that they have to do, but collecting data for it, considering it in their actions and implementation is really a core part of their mandate and their work, and can be done with the tools and the approaches that they in many cases are already using, but perhaps tweaked for additional considerations. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joe. And conscious of the time, I have one last question for José, maybe. The ocean has no border, and in your case, you really created connectivity within your country to protect nature. But what about transboundary cooperation? What could be a good tool for you?
Gracias por la pregunta. De lo que nos hemos dado cuenta, hay un tema clave interno que es el poder la información científica al
being
nivel tomador de
able to
decisiones.
transfer the
The
information that comes from science to the
independientemente que
policymaker.
sea dentro de las autoridades gubernamentales,
Regardless if the policymaker
incluso la
is
academia,
the
pero hacerla
academic
comprensible
world
para
or
quienes al final toman la
the
decisión.
people at the
Esto nos ha
government. We
ayudado
need
muchísimo
to
en el
make
proceso, en
the
la
scientific
extracción que
information
mencionaba,
comprehensible
las áreas protegidas,
for those in charge
sobre
of
todo la
making
toma de
decisions.
decisiones.
And that has an influence on
Cuando
what areas are
los países y los
designated as
estados muestran
protected
esa
areas
disposición
and
política
in other policies.
asegurar procesos
And
de
also
protección,
political will
los
to
socios
guarantee these
vienen
protected
y
areas.
aparecen
Once there's
justamente
political
por el
will,
compromiso que
then
está
we
confirmado.
see the external
Después de
stakeholders
la
involved. We've
la
seen that very
COP26
clearly
en Egipto,
after the COP, the Conference of the Parties in Egypt, has changed completely the point of view not only from the governments themselves, but also from organizations, from partners that give funding to the countries to be able to continue with the process.
And thank you. Like the link between science and policymaker, I think is key and have been raised a few times. And so thank you for your perspective and for sharing this example. So I will now give back the floor to Spiros for the Slido question. Thank you.
It's already been a very interesting panel. Thank you very much, all of you, for putting this together. Let's move to the questions from Slido. We have quite a few and quite a few targeted ones also for specific speakers. So the first one we have, can we have the Slido questions up on the screen, please? First one then is for Christina, and the question is, globally, the development of offshore renewable energy is rapidly outpacing MSP development and adoption. And the question is, how do you think this peculiarity can be addressed? So, Christina, you can go first, and then anyone from the panel can chip in, of course.
Yes, we do see this happening because this is also related to my experience. We work with members in the Northern Baltic Sea, but also in the Med. And if, for instance, we take the Med, where offshore developments are actually, there are already connections to the grid that have been requested, but there are not real plans in terms of strategy for offshore, but not even MSPs that will be submitted very soon, but they're not there. So this means that this is a challenge, and actually a coordination is needed at the member states level, because if we do not address properly offshore developments in the MSP process, we are going to delay further the process, so that accelerating does not mean to do things not properly. This is my...
Thank you. Yes, Paul?
Yeah, just to add to this, I would like to maybe make a suggestion that stronger exchange with new countries or new markets could happen to those countries who have implemented offshore wind already, because they were the first movers. They had to pay for it because the first prices of energy was about 200 euros per megawatt hour. Today it's actually 50. So it really has come down in price a lot because of the basic, lots of experience and improvements. And new countries could really use this kind of second mover advantage and hit the ground running and capitalize and leverage more on existing practices. So I have this impression that very often there's a reinvention of the wheel very often, and maybe a more targeted concept or template could be generated.
Right. Thank you very much, Paul. And if we don't have anyone taking up any point on this question, let's move to the second one, which is addressed to you, Paul, again. So do you think, actually the question is, who do you think will be the authority of the MSP on the high seas, and how to guarantee marine conservation when expanding offshore wind farms? You touched the issue of offshore and
yes, and I have the great privilege of being an academic and don't have to tiptoe around this issue, because there's a lot of tiptoeing, in my observation, around this in the international legal arena, let me call it like this. And from my perspective, this is a forum that's a natural element that could play an important part. It's MSP Global. All the expertise we have globally is actually in this room. So who else, if not this forum, should be involved in this? In terms of international organization, I'm not an expert in international law, but as far as I understand, the IOC is being designated in UNCLOS to when it comes to linking area-based management and the small elements that are mentioned already. So I think the ISC could play a very important role there.
Thank you very much. I think there will anyway need to be quite a lot of both legal and technological developments on how we can do, especially what you were saying for offshore wind production in the open seas, because you all then have a connection to the grid issue, which is a physical infrastructure that needs to be regulated somehow.
Yes, just to add to this, we have now the new developments of floating projects who are generating hydrogen on the site. So this would remove the need to connect to the land.
So that's production and storage in some ways, yeah. Thank you very much. All right, let's go to the next question, which is open for everyone to jump on. So we have any recommendations on how to integrate marine ecological restoration on MSP and how to support it from the MSP point of view? Yes, please.
Yes, I think that the first thing is to give enough space for the conservation and protection of biodiversity when we distribute the space in our plans. In Spain, we have established two different types of areas for biodiversity. The first one are priority areas for biodiversity protection, where all the MPAs are included. But we are also thinking on this increasing the surface of MPAs that we have to deal with, the 30% by 2030. And this is why we have another kind of areas, which are the high potential areas for biodiversity conservation, where we have enough data because of different projects or initiatives, and we think that they will be potentially declared in a short or medium term. So these are also included in the plan. So we are a bit of advancing and contributing to the specific objectives that will be included in the specific management plans when the MPA is declared.
Thank you, Marta. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for that. Just briefly to add that I think the recommendation on ecological restoration should be an inherent element of the MSP. Perhaps the point is that they can bring in a number of sectors and communities that would not normally invest in restoration. But if you could put a value on a restoration effort, a blue carbon area or high, other biodiversity areas, you can actually unlock investment in private sector through an MSP process, which not normally would be available.
I think that's a very interesting point. So the entry point is on how you put values and get the investment process going, so supporting this thing. Any further comments on this question? No. So we'll go to the next one, which is considering all life cycle of overseas wind farms. Do you consider there is enough evidence to ensure that they are sustainable? For example, rare mineral extraction and so on. It's the ever-coming back question about sustainability of wind farms in general, and here it is about the overseas wind farms. So anyone want to take this up? Yes, Christine.
I can only say that we are looking into this because, of course, we also think that the overall business should be sustainable. But at the moment, I would not dare to say that there is enough evidence. But we can actually come up with a conclusion after having investigated this further.
Thank you. And Paul?
Just to add to this, the environmental impact on sustainability issues compared to the alternative of using fossil fuels, for example, is much stronger. Interestingly, there is in development already a working group within the offshore wind industry looking at the issues of rare earths, because this clearly is an issue.
Thank you. I think that's a very valid point, because of course we can doubt the sustainability of everything, but then it is a matter also of prioritization, comparativeness, and what, and of course there's always room for improvement, but it's what is the alternative? And that's an important thing to take into account. And this, I think, will be the last question in terms of time, but this one, I think, is a very interesting one. It says, any experiences on using decision support tools for prioritizing sites for key biogenic habitat, for example, shellfish beds, restoration and recovery? Cheers. So, who wants to respond to cheers? I mean, I can broaden a bit the discussion, the question to help you, because this is using decision support tools for prioritizing sites. It doesn't necessarily have to be for biogenic habitat like shellfish, but prioritizing on how we go about restoration and protection. So any existing tools that you would like to share with us? Yes, Ole, please.
Well, there's a whole range of conservation planning tools, strategic planning, MPA location and siting. Maxan is one. I mean, there's many, many more. Perhaps the question begs to the point that they need to be brought out more and be made more practical and sort of common sort of access tools, and less academic. And the whole issue of making things more practical and robust.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think, to stay within time, we now have, we have a little bit of time more to go for a few more questions. So let's go to the next one. When fostering overseas wind farms in APNJ, I don't know what APNJ is. Beyond national jurisdiction. Thank you, Antonio. Are other ways to go carbon neutral considered? For example, NBS like seagrass meadows, mangroves, and so on. So that's again for alternative approaches. Maybe that's a little bit technical, but if anyone has any insight of that. Antonia, the fact that you're moving your head means you have something to share with us about this question?
Yes, indeed. I think nature-based solution maybe should be the first step for the priority to mitigate climate change. But we also need renewables because we consume energy and we will still consume more in the future. So I think the question here is more what will be the environmental impact, and the trade-off between putting offshore renewable in area beyond national jurisdictions, how they will be also managed, by which authority. I think it's a key question to ensure also benefits, because the IC is owned by no one and everyone in a way. So this is a current discussion within the BBNG also context and the COP. So I think there will be some development. But first, I think nature-based solution is key to restore ecosystem.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now we come to the final question, which is the next one. How much coherence did you eventually find between MSP and MSFD? What's the main contradiction between these two policies? So we're all familiar with MSFD. Yes, Marta.
Yes, thank you very much. We've been working very hard to link both regulatory initiatives, and I wouldn't say that there is a contradiction. I think that they're very, very much complementary, and they are, as I explained in my initial intervention, they are helping each other very much. Because in the marine strategies, we are already doing a hard work trying to achieve this good environmental status. We are monitoring a lot of aspects of the marine environment, including pressures, which are very, very relevant for the MSP to be sustainable and to implement this ecosystem approach in the marine spatial plans. So I think that the MSFD is a powerful tool for planning, to do it correctly and to do it in a sustainable way. So I don't really find any contradiction, really, between them. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further points about the relation to MSFD? Because I think that Marta is very right. There's actually more coherence and complementarity rather than lack of coherence between the two. I mean, the one can be feeding very much into the other in a very significant way, and that's, I think, also the thinking behind the way it was all developed as part of the toolbox, let's say, of the European Commission around this whole process. Yes, Antonio? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what is really good in terms of policy coherence as well is that we have seen some countries in the EU updating the MSP process because they had to report on MSFD indicator. So it was also an incentive to have a stronger MSP.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have 2 minutes. Would you like to take one more question? Since people are putting them up on Slido. So the next question that has been voted with 6 votes, 6 votes is how would you agree that the best decarbonization action is to avoid energy consumption in the first place? No, yes, no. But when we would address the growth on time? Okay, there's a lot of philosophy there, but I mean, just to facilitate a bit of discussion, it's clear that the best way to not have emissions is to reduce energy consumption, but that's why I'm saying there's a lot of philosophy, because we have to see how we can arrive to this. I see Christina ready to take it up, and I think you also wanted to say something, Antonio?
I would say that the preamble to everything that I presented is actually investing in energy efficiency and demand-side response. I mean, is actually the answer. So that we need actually to reduce as much as possible the deployment of infrastructure in general. So that this is, something that we need to do. There are already optimizations that are happening. So that, for instance, we have shared renewable energy generation, or we have interconnectors from a grid perspective, so that all of these are actually reducing the infrastructure development. In terms of reducing the consumption, of course, it's a model, first of all, a consumption model, but by applying energy efficiency better and demand-side response, this can be actually done.
Thank you. And Antonia.
Yeah, the answer is yes. But I think it's a bit challenging also for people to concretely change habits. So energy efficiency is key. And I think while we live in the energy crisis, for us to overcome this is to have a multi-pronged approach. So we look at energy efficiency in terms of consumptions, but also in terms of improving the technology on offshore renewable energy so they can produce more using less space. So all this question is arising, but it's not only about the marine environment, it's also about the land interaction, or building, how they are made, and so this will take years. So yes, but it's a multi-pronged approach on this issue, I would say.
Great. So thank you all very much for participating first in the panel and then the answering to the questions. I think we now have to move to the final bit, which is the report that will be delivered from our rapporteur. So Eric Rosalazar, please take the floor and deliver the report of this session. Thank you.
Buenos días. Thank you very much for the great presentations and discussion. I will try to do it justice and interpret my calligraphy. There were some certain themes that kept coming up in your presentations, and I will just say a few of them and then elaborate. The how, the who, cooperating, frameworks, policy, implementation, and indicators, measurement. First, the how. I think we have very clear how we can do many of these things, but we need to communicate better between ourselves. How are we going to do this? How are we going to implement? What do we need? And this comes up with what Joseph was saying. We have a lot of measurements that we need to do. We have a lot of commitments. How are we going to reach them? Because we are not reaching them in time, and time is running out. The who is going to be involved, and how do we involve them? Not even at a national level, agencies are collaborating and talking between themselves, and we're also talking about transboundary and working with other governments. How are we going to do this if nationally we are having trouble communicating and working? So I think we need to really understand and see successful experiences and learn from them, and see how we can cooperate and take those ideas, like Jose Julio was saying, how 4 countries are getting together and cooperating, identifying how they are going to protect, how they're going to conserve the species, and try and implement similar. It's not going to be the same recipe, but at least we can learn from it. We already have frameworks in place for many of these things, and I think it was a continuing topic. For it to be successful, we really need these frameworks from the start, I think. Ole was very clear saying for the restoration, we need to know what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and if we're going to do it orderly in a good fashion, we need those ideas first. And then we're going to need how we're going to measure it. What are we going to measure? What are the indicators? Will we know we're being successful or not? Is what we are implementing having a difference? Will we do it differently in 4 years if we're not measuring? And I think this goes along with another topic that was talked about in the people that are going to be taking these measurements. They need to understand the benefit of this work, of the MSP, of following up, and because if it's just an extra thing they have to do, then they won't be happy, they won't be interested. So we need to see how we can make them see how it will benefit their job to take this information. The harmonization was also a very important topic, and I think that comes with cooperation and communication, not only regionally, but globally. If we are going to take measurements, if we want to see what we are achieving and we want to compare, we need the data to be easily understood across borders, and we need cooperation to teach each other how we're doing this. Another thing that was very interesting is the cooperation between the private sector and NGOs and governments. And I liked the phrase that was told that acceleration does not mean that we're going to do it efficiently. We need to be moving faster, and if there are sectors that are willing to cooperate and do things together, then we need to start moving faster. We need to accelerate, and we need to make sure that those guidelines, those frameworks are in place. It is, in regards to ABNJ, I think we're already getting there too late, and we cannot continue waiting for the conversations at the UN. We need to start moving and thinking and preparing of how this is going to happen. If we wait until we have the framework and we wait until we know which is the agency that's going to do it, then we have to wait until how we're going to implement it, how we're going to do it. We need to start having these discussions from now so that we can move faster. Have those objectives clearly defined, and the support tools. I think it's quite important, the technology and the sharing of information, and I am very thankful for the variety that's in this conference. It's not only Eurocentric, there's a lot of countries here, and I think that knowledge needs to trickle down to South America, Central America, Caribbean, Africa, Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, and those support tools, that knowledge can be shared so that we don't take as long as Europe, North America has taken, but we can accelerate and move faster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this concise and very comprehensive summing up of what we heard in this session. And please join me in giving a hand to Eric, Antonia, and all of our speakers in this session. Which now brings us to the end of the morning part of today's program. We will start again at 2 o'clock with the very interesting 8th session on sustainable blue economy. So please make sure you will be back here at 2 o'clock. Let me remind you that you can take your food and go to the reception area where we're having coffee to have your lunch. And see you in a while. Enjoy lunch.